All right, so we are more than a week into the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it's becoming increasingly unclear how this war is actually going to end. But if we look at how we got here and how NATO's expansion played into the conflict, could we find a way out before the war gets even worse? As the Soviet Union began collapsing in 1991, Ukraine was among the many republics that declared independence from Moscow. And as a new nation, it began building relations with the West, including establishing ties with NATO in 1992, when Ukraine joined the group's North Atlantic Cooperation Council. Then NATO Secretary General Manfred Wörner even paid an official visit to Kyiv. It laid the groundwork for what would become Ukraine's delicate but important relationship with the bloc. Ukrainian armed forces even went on to help NATO forces in Iraq in 2003. Ukraine's senior commander said during their departure, "We are leaving this place, but Ukrainian colors will be represented in the Republic of Iraq. Our soldiers will continue serving in the NATO training mission." But it was still a loose relationship. In fact, Ukraine wasn't politically stable, and back then, Moscow had pretty good relations with the West as well. But when pro-Western Viktor Yushchenko was elected president of Ukraine during the Orange Revolution in 2005, he promised Ukrainians a new era that was cutting ties with the Kremlin. And at a 2008 NATO summit, he officially sought NATO membership, something George W. Bush and others back then calling it a bold decision. Despite at least 7 Western allies, including Germany, France, and Italy, strongly opposing it, the fear of how it would antagonize Russia stopped the move, because for decades, Russia made it quite clear that they viewed NATO expansion as a security threat, and the U.S. seemed to understand that. And according to declassified documents in the early 90s, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker agreed with Mikhail Gorbachev's statement in response to the assurances that NATO expansion is unacceptable. President Boris Yeltsin warned again in 1994 that NATO's expansion threatened to make an enemy of Russia. And current CIA director, the one who is currently serving in this administration, Bill Burns, said in a 2008 memo, back when he was the ambassador to Russia, that Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine in NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests. But in the years that followed, NATO membership did expand eastward, just not into Ukraine. Then in 2014, the Ukrainian government suddenly reversed course, ending key trade talks with the European Union in a bid to revive ties with Russia. And you know what all that led to next. Months of mass rallies, violent dispersal of protesters, hundreds killed or injured, and eventually Russia's invasion and annexation of Crimea. Ukraine emerged more committed than ever towards pursuing membership in NATO. That pursuit is a historic part of this conflict that cannot be ignored. The prospect of Ukraine in military alliance with the West is clearly something Moscow saw as a threat. But take a look at Putin's recent behavior and his demands in this current conflict. To stop the war, this is what he's asking for: a fully demilitarized Ukraine, the official handing over of Crimea and areas in the Donbass region, the promise of Ukraine's neutrality, and in a speech last week, he explicitly said Ukraine actually never had stable traditions of real statehood. Now, all this does make you wonder, does this conflict go well beyond Ukraine's NATO membership at this point, or could that subject still be a key way to off-ramp the war that is already underway? And given Putin's demands, what exactly should the West be willing to offer, or should they demand themselves to help bring an end to this war? Joining me now to discuss this is Christine Berezina, head of geopolitics at the German Marshall Fund's Alliance for Securing Democracy, and Justin Logan, senior fellow at the Cato Institute. It's great to have both of you with us, and I know we have opposing ideas here, so I'm looking forward to this debate. But Justin, let me start with you. You tweeted yesterday that any off-ramp would likely involve compromise that U.S. officials refused to make before the war. If Russia starts winning decisively, the offer will have to be sweeter. From your vantage point, what kind of off-ramp do you think is possible right now at this stage?
Well, I think it's important to clarify at the outset that Congress has made clear that they're unaware of any off-ramp that exists. And I think that's maybe the most essential idea here is that, what we're doing right now is imposing dramatic sanctions that are causing great pain in Russia. And the question that is obviously raised is what could stop the pain? And I think there are a number of ideas that suggest themselves, for example, leave Ukraine, for example. But I'm afraid that we're going to wind back up at the place where we're talking about Ukraine's NATO membership. And in fact, I think Ukraine's NATO membership is much further away today than it was 10 days ago. And so the tragedy, I think, here might be that where we're going to wind up ultimately, diplomatically, in terms of this war, was something that could have prevented the war in the first place. Do I know that that's the case? No. But I know that we will now never know because we didn't try.
Christine, I want to give you a chance to respond to that. How much does what we're seeing today have to do with NATO? It was last January, of course, you may recall that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky actually posed the question to Joe Biden in an interview with Axios on HBO. He literally asked, why is Ukraine still not a part of NATO? And I'm curious to get your thoughts. Is this what this is about? Because on the one hand, it seems like it is. But then on the other hand, Putin's also been claiming there is genocide going on, which we know not to be true. He's talked about denazifying Ukraine, which we know is not true. And now we see that his motivations are to basically eliminate Ukrainian statehood entirely.
NATO is one part of it, but what you have to understand is that the issue is not NATO. It goes down to the agency of the Ukrainian people, or even the existence of the Ukrainian people as such. Vladimir Putin questions the existence of Ukrainians as legitimate citizens of a country that he thinks doesn't exist and has never really existed. And he doesn't believe that citizens anywhere in his country or in Ukraine should be able to set the course for their own political decisions and for their own alliances. President Putin is an autocrat, and he believes that his opinion is the opinion that matters for his country and for the countries around him. He does not believe that any of the countries near him should be part of NATO because he views NATO as an aggressor to Russia. That is not true. But when you ask whether this is about NATO, about Ukraine joining NATO, I think it's about Ukraine having agency, Ukraine existing, and Ukraine choosing not to go in the direction of Moscow, not choosing its own autocrats, not suppressing its own population, but instead fighting for democracy, fighting to reduce corruption, fighting to have the values and the institutions that we would recognize in Europe or in the United States or in Canada, Japan, South Korea, part of the developed democratic Western world. That is the problem. NATO is a proxy for talking about this in Putin's speak, but it is not the whole piece, which is why I think if we had stopped talking about NATO earlier, I don't think that would have helped, because any time the EU came up, it would have just been as bad. If you look at the Maidan, you look at what created the Crimean situation in 2014, it wasn't a conversation about NATO. It was a conversation about the EU. Again, this is a conversation about values, about the kind of government that Ukraine can have. So it's really deeper than just NATO and NATO open door policies.
Justin, let me play devil's advocate here and say, should we have taken Ukraine into NATO sooner? Had we done this, would this have pushed Russia back off of Ukraine? If we would have done what we have done with other countries, whether it be the countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, that are now off the table for Russia, and they know that they are not going to, quote unquote, mess with them because they are part of NATO. Had we brought Ukraine into NATO much sooner, in the mid-90s, even earlier, after they participated in the war in Iraq, would that have changed the dynamic and the calculus for Putin and averted this?
Well, in the mid-90s is it? Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, Justin. Sorry, that question was to Justin. Sorry, Christine. 1 second. Justin, go ahead.
Got it. The mid-90s is a different question. I mean, I think it's important to point out you don't even have Poland in NATO at that point. So it would have been a real dramatic move to have put them in then. If you look, for example, in the mid-2000s, right, we made this sort of compromise in 2008 where we said the Bush administration, as your opening pointed out, was driving very hard to get Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. And the French and Germans, among others, said, no, we can't defend those countries. We shouldn't do that. So the compromise was we said they're going to join NATO someday, but we're not going to give them what's called a membership action plan, which is a sort of set plan for their accession to NATO. If you had given Ukraine a membership action plan in the mid-2000s, I think it's quite likely you would have gotten Ukraine invaded in the mid-2000s. This, I think, if we want to take this into this metaphysical realm of what Ukrainian identity means and parsing through this history, that is not a recipe for ending the conflict. We need to bring it down to material facts that are transactional. And I want to concede, I don't know that we can stop this war with a sort of compromise over Ukraine's status vis-a-vis NATO. But it seems to me immensely tragic that Ukraine now has no hope of joining NATO, and we didn't even try that as a diplomatic route, not as an off-ramp to the war, but to have prevented the war in the first place. I mean, you heard the U.S. Secretary of State say NATO can't commit not to admit a member in the future. Well, of course it can. NATO can do whatever it likes, as well as any single of its 30 member states could say, you know what, we don't think we can defend Ukraine, and therefore we're not going to vote for its accession. But there was this paralysis among NATO members that no one wanted to offend the United States, which was saying the door was going to remain open. The U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was in Ukraine in October, urging it to make reforms so that it could join NATO. And I think that all of this fanned these flames, whether we want to call them neuroses or what, in Moscow, that we were actually trying to bring Ukraine into NATO. And this, unfortunately, has helped bring us to the situation in which we find ourselves today.
So, Christine, what is the off-ramp? Because if we were going to take what Justin was talking about, and these are actual tangible solutions, what is the tangible solution right now? We can't just say to the Russians, get out of Ukraine completely. We can say it. I mean, we are saying it. But the truth is, the Russians are not going to listen to us. Even with these sanctions, the war is still being prosecuted. We know that for years, top foreign policy strategists in this country have been warning that NATO's expansion would be a very serious mistake. I don't agree with Henry Kissinger on anything, but even Henry Kissinger said that Ukraine should not join NATO. And a former U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union called NATO's expansion the most strategic blunder and would pose a great security threat. People have argued that the presence of NATO so deep into Eastern Europe is part of the reason what prompted Vladimir Putin to rise to power and maintain that power with his narrative.
Eamon, I think I just fundamentally disagree with a lot of the suppositions that you are making and that Justin has said. I think that if there was a quicker way for Ukraine to have gotten in right after 2008, we wouldn't have seen Russia's aggression the way that we had. Ukraine, NATO's open door policy exists so that countries like Sweden, Finland, that are suddenly polling pro-NATO entry, Sweden just under 50%, Finland over, so that door opens also for these very close integral partners. It is a very profound and important part of NATO policy. And again, it's up to the country itself to define its path, and not for the U.S. to talk to Moscow and say, this one's yours, this one's ours. That's been the whole problem of the first half of the 20th century. Playing like that is not going to lead to peace and stability anywhere. And Yalta didn't exactly work. Why would we reinvent that? But I think let's talk practically about what is possible for Ukraine. It is possible for Ukraine, even under a partially occupied status, to enter the EU. So rather than talking about just NATO accession, I think close partnership with Western countries, as we see right now on defense matters, can continue. I think it is impractical to talk about NATO membership anytime soon, but that was made clear to President Putin even before this war. The fact that there is no prospect in this decade for Ukraine to join NATO. So we talked about it. That was perfectly out in the open. Everyone said it explicitly. Yet that didn't matter for Putin. I think what is possible for Ukraine is closer accession into the EU, to stand by its policies, to have to contend with occupation, however it shakes out in the months to come. And yet it can join other institutions more closely. I think we will have to contend with what happens to Crimea, what happens to Donetsk and Luhansk. There could be de facto realities on the ground and lack of recognition. But, I think the kind of membership we should be talking about is EU and close defense.
Yeah, and it seems that the Ukrainian president obviously submitting his application earlier this week is an indication of that is where Ukraine wants to go. Guys, I know we didn't agree on much, but I appreciate your civility. I certainly appreciate your insights and your analysis. I look forward to continuing this conversation. Let's just hope the war ends quickly for everyone's sake.